The courtroom smelled like old wood and cold coffee. I noticed that the moment I pushed through the heavy double doors, my heels clicking against the tile floor in a rhythm that felt too loud for how quiet everything suddenly became. Every head turned, and I mean every single one. My mother was already seated at the far left of the gallery, her hands folded neatly in her lap the way she always did when she wanted people to think she was composed. She looked at me the way she used to look at report cards that disappointed her. Not with anger exactly, but with that particular kind of exhaustion that said, she had expected this, she had expected me to embarrass her. I could see it in the 2 seconds before she turned away. My father sat beside her. He didn't turn away. He stared, long and slow, from my boots to the top of my cover. And then he did something that I felt in my chest, like a door slamming. He leaned over to my mother and whispered something, and she pressed her lips together and looked down at her purse. I kept walking. I was wearing my dress uniform. Every ribbon, every badge, every inch of it pressed and perfect. I had been awake since 4 a.m, making sure of that. Not because I needed the armor, though. I won't pretend it didn't feel like armor. I wore it because I had earned it, because it was mine, and because I had spent the last 11 years of my life becoming someone my parents had told me I was never capable of becoming. If they were going to be in that room, then so was every single thing I had done without them. My lawyer, Claire, was already at our table. She looked up when I walked in, and her expression did something complicated. A quick assessment, a flicker of something I couldn't quite read, and then a small nod. She slid a yellow legal pad toward me as I sat down and leaned close. "They brought a second attorney," she said quietly. "And your uncle is here." I didn't look toward my uncle's side of the room. Not yet. I already knew what I would see. I set my cover on the table in front of me and folded my hands over it, and I breathed. Just breathed. I had been in worse rooms than this. I had been in rooms where the wrong decision meant people died. This was a wood-paneled room in Greenville, South Carolina, and the only thing at stake was a house. Just a house. Except it wasn't just a house. It had never been just a house. My grandmother's name was Ruth Eleanor Hayward, and she raised me from the time I was 9 years old. My parents didn't abandon me. That's not the word for what happened. What happened was quieter and more complicated than abandonment. What happened was that my mother decided, when I was 9, that her career required her to relocate to Phoenix. And my father went where my mother went, and I was enrolled in school in Greenville and doing well, and it was only supposed to be temporary. Temporary stretched into a year, and a year stretched into 2. And then one summer I realized I had stopped expecting them to come back and started thinking of my grandmother's house as home. It happened the way most important things happen, not in a single moment, but in the accumulation of small ones. It happened in the Tuesday afternoons when my grandmother picked me up from school and had a snack waiting on the kitchen table and asked about my day in a way that required a real answer. It happened in the Saturday mornings when she let me help in the garden and taught me the names of things, not just the common names, but the Latin ones, because she said you should always know the real name of what you were dealing with. It happened in the evenings when she read aloud after dinner, not children's books, but real books, the kind with complicated sentences and ideas that required sitting with them for a while, and she never talked down to me about what we read but talked across to me, as though my opinion was a thing worth having. It happened the winter I was 10, and got sick with a fever that kept me home from school for 2 weeks, and my grandmother slept in the chair beside my bed for the first 3 nights without being asked and without mentioning it afterward. It happened the spring I was 11, when a girl at school said something cruel about my parents not wanting me, and I came home and didn't say anything at dinner, and my grandmother looked at me once over her coffee cup and said, "Whatever somebody said to you today, I want you to remember that people who say cruel things are almost always in pain themselves. That doesn't excuse it, but it explains it." She had not asked what happened. She had simply known something had. My grandmother never made me feel like a burden. That was the remarkable thing about her. She was a small woman, barely 5'2". With gray hair she kept pinned up and a voice that was quiet but absolute. She had grown up in rural Georgia, married a man who worked the railroad, raised 4 children in a house with 1 bathroom and a garden. She tended like it was her 5th child. She had buried that man when she was 63 and kept right on going. She taught me how to do things. Real things. How to read a contract. How to change a tire. How to look a person in the eye when they were trying to intimidate you and wait them out in silence until they ran out of breath. She also told me, when I was 16 and already thinking about enlisting, that I should do it. That I had the kind of mind and the kind of stubbornness that the military would either break or turn into something extraordinary. She said she had a feeling it would be the second one. She was right. What my grandmother gave me that no one else did was the particular gift of being taken seriously. She never spoke to me the way adults speak to children when they have already decided the child's opinion doesn't count. When I was 11 and told her I wanted to read the newspaper, she handed it to me and then asked what I thought about what I'd read. When I was 13 and got into a fight at school because a boy said girls couldn't do the same physical training as boys, and I had proved him wrong in front of the entire PE class and gotten sent to the principal's office for it. My grandmother listened to the whole story and then said, very calmly, "Were you right?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Then you'll survive the principal's office." When I was 15 and my parents called for Christmas, and my mother spent most of the conversation talking about her own life and asked me almost nothing about mine, my grandmother watched me hang up the phone and said nothing for a while, and then she said, "Some people only know how to love from a distance. That's a limitation in them, not a verdict on you." I carried that sentence into every hard room I ever walked into after that. There were other sentences, too. She had a way of saying things once, clearly, and then not repeating them, trusting that you had heard. When I was 17 and doubting whether I was actually capable of the things I wanted to do, she sat down across from me at the kitchen table with her coffee and said, "Diana, the people who told you what you couldn't do were working from incomplete information." That was it. That was the whole speech. She picked up her coffee and went back to her newspaper, and left me sitting there with that sentence rearranging something in my chest. When I was 19 and home on leave for the first time after basic, I came back different in ways I was still learning to name. I was harder in some places and more uncertain in others, and I didn't know yet how those two things could coexist in the same person. My grandmother looked at me for a long moment when I walked through the door, and then she said, "You look like yourself, just more so." She meant it as a compliment. It was the most accurate thing anyone said to me that entire leave. I enlisting in the army at 18. My mother called it a phase. My father said I was throwing away college. My uncle Robert, my mother's brother, who had always had opinions about things that were none of his business, told anyone who would listen that I was running away from my problems, that I couldn't hack it in the real world. I remember the particular way he said it at my grandmother's kitchen table, the Thanksgiving before I left, his fork halfway to his mouth, his voice carrying that tone he had that was designed to sound like concern but functioned like dismissal. Robert was 61 years old at the time of this hearing, 2 years older than my mother, and he had spent most of his adult life in mid-level management positions that never quite led where he thought they would. He had married twice. He had a daughter from the first marriage who was cordial but distant. He had a son from the second marriage who was currently in college on a partial scholarship that Robert supplemented with money he didn't have easily to spare. He drove a car that was newer than he could comfortably afford, and he wore watches that telegraphed success in a way that success itself had never quite managed to. I don't say this to be uncharitable. I say it because it explains something about the kind of man who spends 6 weeks after his mother's funeral hiring a lawyer to contest her final wishes. He had spent his whole life feeling like he had been given slightly less than he deserved, and that feeling had become the organizing principle of everything he did. My grandmother knew this about him. She had loved him with the particular tenacity that mothers have for the children who are hardest to love, and she had seen him clearly, and she had made her decision clear. I remember looking at Robert across that Thanksgiving table and feeling something settle in me that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with resolve. I thought, I will outlast your opinion of me. I didn't say it. I didn't need to. I remember my grandmother standing in the driveway the morning I left for basic, her hand raised in a wave, no tears on her face, just steadiness. Just that look she had, that meant she believed in you completely and didn't feel the need to make a whole production out of it. I made it through basic. I made it through AIT. I was stationed at Fort Bragg and then at Fort Campbell, and then I was deployed. Twice. And then I applied for something I had no business applying for, according to everyone who knew me. And I got in. And I trained for things I still can't discuss in detail. And I came out the other side as a warrant officer in Army intelligence, with a specialty in human intelligence operations, and a service record that had earned me a commendation I kept in a frame in my apartment, and rarely thought about, until mornings like this one. My grandmother came to every promotion ceremony that was open to family. She drove herself until she was 81, and then she let me fly her out. She wore the same navy blue dress to each one, with a small gold pin at the collar that had belonged to her mother. She shook the hands of every superior officer who came near her with the straightforward confidence of a woman who had decided long ago that rank was something you respected, but not something that was supposed to make you small. My commanding officer at my warrant officer promotion told me afterward that my grandmother was one of the most remarkable women he had ever briefly met. I told him I knew. My parents came twice in 11 years. My uncle came 0 times. During those years away, I wrote to my grandmother, actual letters, on paper, because she didn't trust email for anything important, and I had come to agree with her. She wrote back on the same pale blue stationery she had used my entire life, her handwriting careful and precise, filling both sides of the page. She told me about the garden and the neighbors and what she was reading. She told me about Robert's latest business venture and my mother's latest renovation project, with a dry, affectionate humor that made me feel like I was sitting at her kitchen table, even when I was 8,000 miles away. She asked questions. Real questions. Specific ones. Not the vague, "how are you doing" questions that people ask when they don't actually want to know. She asked what I was learning. She asked what was hard. She asked who I was becoming. I answered honestly. I don't think I answered honestly with anyone else the way I did with her. There was one letter she sent me during my second deployment that I have read more times than I can count. It arrived when I was in a place I can't name, during a stretch of weeks that were the hardest of my career, and I had been running on very little sleep, and a particular kind of mental weight that accumulates when you are responsible for decisions that have no good answers. The letter was 6 pages, the longest she had ever written. She talked about my grandfather's stories I had never heard, about the early years of their marriage, when money was short, and the future was uncertain, and there were weeks when the only thing holding them together was the decision to keep going. She talked about the year my mother was born, and the fear that came with that, and the way fear and love are sometimes indistinguishable from each other. She talked about raising 4 children in a world that was not always kind, and the specific terror and grace of watching each of them become someone you hadn't predicted. And then at the end, she wrote something that I read and then folded the letter and sat with for a very long time. She wrote, "I have never once worried about whether you would be all right. I have worried about you the way you worry about anyone you love, with that ordinary fear that lives in the background of caring for a person. But I have never worried about whether you would be all right in the end. Some people you just know. You are one of those people. Whatever room you are in right now, you already have everything you need to walk out of it. You have always had that. I didn't give it to you. I just didn't take it away." I carried that letter in my breast pocket for the remaining 6 weeks of that deployment. The last time I saw my grandmother before the stroke, I flew down to Greenville in October, just for a long weekend, no occasion. She was 85 and still sharp, still tending the garden in the mornings, still reading in the evenings, still sending letters on the pale blue stationery. We sat on the back porch on the Saturday afternoon and drank coffee and talked for 4 hours about everything and nothing about a novel she had just finished, about a neighbor's daughter who had just gotten into medical school, about the state of the climbing rows along the fence which had put out an unusually good season, about my work in the vaguest terms I was permitted to use, about whether the peony by the back gate needed to be divided in the spring. At some point in the late afternoon she went quiet in a way that was different from her usual comfortable quiet, and I looked at her, and she was looking at the garden with an expression I couldn't entirely read. After a while she said, "I've had a good life, Diana. I want you to know that, whatever happens, I've had a very good life." I said I knew. She said, "The house will be yours. I've made sure of that. I want you to do something with the garden. Not change it, just keep it going. It knows what it's doing. It just needs someone to trust it. I said I would. She looked at me then and smiled. And it was the smile she had when she was about to say something she had been thinking about for a while. She said, "You turned out better than I had any right to expect. Not because of anything I did. Because of who you decided to be." I flew back to Virginia on Sunday evening, and we talked on the phone twice in the months after that. And then, in March, she had her stroke on a Thursday morning. And that was the last thing she ever said to me that I can remember clearly. "You turned out better than I had any right to expect." She left me the house. The house at 412 Birchwood Lane in Greenville, South Carolina. 3 bedrooms, a wrap-around porch, a garden that had been tended for 40 years, and needed someone who understood it. She left it to me in a will that was clear, witnessed, notarized, and filed with the county. She left it to me, and she left a letter explaining why, and the letter said, among other things, that I was the one who had shown up, not the others. My Uncle Robert hired a lawyer 6 weeks after the funeral. He contested the will on the grounds that my grandmother had been subject to undue influence and not of fully sound mind. At the time the most recent version was signed. The most recent version had been signed 4 years ago, when my grandmother was 82, sharp, driving herself to the grocery store, and had just finished reading a 300-page biography of Ulysses S. Grant that she had strong opinions about. My parents were not contesting the will, but they had driven from Phoenix to Greenville for moral support, and the person they were morally supporting was Robert, and here we were. Claire Beaumont had been practicing law in South Carolina for 22 years. When she first called me after I retained her, she asked 3 questions. How often did you visit? Did you ever discuss the will? Did your grandmother have her own attorney? The answers were, as often as I could get leave. Yes, but she brought it up. And yes, Gerald Foss, 19 years her attorney, still practicing, still available to testify. Claire said, "Good," in the tone of someone who had just confirmed that the foundation was solid. She was thorough in a way I respected. She sent me a detailed list of every document she needed and had it all organized before opposing counsel had filed their second motion. She called me every Friday with an update, even when the update was simply that nothing had changed, because she understood that uncertainty is its own kind of weight, and that being informed is one of the few things you can actually control when a legal process is happening to you. She never overpromised. She never catastrophized. She said what she knew, acknowledged what she didn't, and moved forward. On the morning of the hearing, I met her in the courthouse lobby at 8:45. She looked at my uniform once, thoroughly, the way she looked at everything. And then she said, "Good choice." That was all. Then she handed me a folder with the day's documents, and we went over the key points for 10 minutes. And then the doors opened. Robert's attorney went first. He was polished and practiced, and his argument was built on suggestion rather than substance, the implication of dependence, the implication of influence, the careful use of words like vulnerable and isolated and disproportionate. He never said anything that was demonstrably false. He arranged true things in a sequence that created a false picture, which is a different skill and, in some ways, a more dangerous one. I watched him and I thought about the interrogation training I had received years ago, about how the most effective misleading statements are the ones that require the listener to do the work of completing the deception themselves. I watched the judge. He was writing on his legal pad. He had not looked up. Then Claire stood up, and she laid out the truth with the same precision she brought to everything. The documentation, the notarization, the deposition of Gerald Foss, who had known Ruth Hayward for 19 years and who stated without qualification that she had been of sound mind, had expressed her wishes without prompting, and had asked intelligent questions about the document before signing it. Claire presented the records of my visits not as evidence of manipulation, as opposing counsel had framed them, but as evidence of exactly what they were. A granddaughter who showed up. Then Claire said there was one more document she wished to enter into the record. The letter. I had found out about it the same way everyone else had from the estate executor, 3 weeks after the funeral, in a phone call during which he read me the first paragraph, and I had to ask him to stop because I was standing in a parking lot outside a grocery store, and I was not prepared to hear the rest of it in a parking lot. I went home and he called again, and I sat at my kitchen table and listened to all 4 pages, and then I sat there for a long time afterward, doing nothing in particular. My grandmother had written it on a Tuesday in January, 3 years before she died. She had not told anyone. She had given it to Gerald Foss with instructions to include it with the estate documents to be distributed after her death. Gerald Foss had done exactly as instructed, because Ruth Hayward had asked him to, and because in 19 years of working with her, he had learned that she did not make requests without reasons, and her reasons were always sound. The letter said things about all of her children. It was not unkind, but it was honest, which is sometimes its own kind of difficult. It said things about Robert that were accurate, and that he would not enjoy hearing in a public room. It said things about my mother that were complicated and loving in the way that the truth about people you love is always complicated. And then it talked about me, and what it said about me was the kind of thing that you spend your whole life hoping someone who knows you well is thinking, and almost never get to hear out loud. And she had written it down so that I would hear it, and she had timed it so that I would hear it when I needed it most, which was exactly what she would have done. Near the end, it said, Diana showed up. That is the whole of it. She showed up when it was hard, and when it was inconvenient, and when no one was watching, and when there was nothing in it for her. She showed up because she loved me. I know the difference. When the last line was read into the record, the room was quiet in a way that had texture to it. That particular quality of silence, that means a room full of people is holding something at once. Then Judge Whitfield set down his pen. He looked at me and he looked at the uniform, and his expression went quiet in that specific way. I recognized the way a person's face goes when they are placing something, when something they weren't expecting is suddenly, clearly, in front of them. He said, Warrant Officer Hayward, forgive me. Are you the same Diana Hayward who was attached to the 160th SOAR and cited in the after-action documentation from the Kabul evacuation operations in August of 2021? Every sound in the room stopped. I said, Yes, Your Honor. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I was 82nd Airborne. 2 tours, 89 and 91. I appreciate your service, Warrant Officer. More than I can adequately say in this setting. Robert's attorney began to speak. The judge raised one hand, not looking at him, and the attorney stopped as though a switch had been thrown. Judge Whitfield said, I've reviewed this case thoroughly. I've read every document submitted by both parties. I've read the deposition of Mr. Kamen, Foss, who I found entirely credible, and I've read the letter that was just entered into evidence, which is one of the clearest and most unambiguous expressions of testamentary intent I have encountered in 23 years on this bench. He paused. He took off his glasses and set them on the desk in front of him. The burden of proof in a will contest rests with the contestant. It is a meaningful burden. It is not met by implication and suggestion. It is not met by the fact of a person's age, or by the fact that a family member visited frequently, or by the fact that the outcome of a will was not what other parties had hoped. He put his glasses back on. The evidence presented by the contestant does not meet that burden, not by a considerable margin. The will of Ruth Eleanor Hayward stands in its entirety. The property at 412 Birchwood Lane is the legal inheritance of Diana Ruth Hayward. This matter is dismissed. The gavel came down once. Claire put her hand briefly on my forearm. I heard Robert stand behind me, heard his attorney's urgent low voice, heard footsteps crossing the room and the sound of the door opening and closing. No words. Just departure. I turned. My parents were still sitting there. My father's face held something I hadn't seen on it in a very long time. That specific expression of a person who has just understood something they should have understood far earlier, and who is feeling the full weight of the lateness of that understanding. My mother was looking at her hands. My father said my name. I said, I'll be outside. I walked out of the courtroom, and through the marble lobby and through the front doors into the April morning. The sun was high and the air was cool, and the city was doing its ordinary things around me. I stood on the courthouse steps and breathed. Claire came out a few minutes later. She stood beside me, and we were quiet for a moment, and then she said, You doing okay? I said yes. She said the whole gallery had heard every word of that judge, every single word, and the woman behind her in the gallery had been crying since the letter. I said I appreciated everything she had done. She said it had been her honor, and she meant it in the plain, direct way. She meant everything. And she shook my hand firmly and walked down toward the parking deck. My mother came out through the door behind me. I heard her footsteps. I had known her walk my entire life. The particular forward-leaning rhythm of it, and I heard her stop a few feet behind me. We were quiet for a while. The traffic moved below on the street. A bird was making considerable noise in the oak tree along the sidewalk. She said I didn't know about the letter. I said I knew. She said my grandmother had never told her. I said she hadn't told me either, that I found out the same way everyone else did, in a phone call 3 weeks after the funeral. There was a silence, and then she said I looked like her, that I'd always looked like her, that when I walked through those doors that morning in my uniform, she had thought for a second, and she stopped herself. She said I had her way of walking into a room like I already knew what was in it. I turned around and looked at her. She was smaller than I carried her in my memory. Or maybe I had simply stopped updating that memory to match who she actually was, now a woman of 63, who had made the choices she had made, and was standing on a courthouse steps on an April morning, beginning to reckon with them. Her eyes were bright, and she was holding herself very still. I said, "She loved you, Mom. She talked about you. She kept your picture on the table in the hall, facing the door, so it was the first thing she saw when she came in." My mother's jaw tightened and her eyes filled, and she did not let them spill, which was the most her thing she could have done, and I felt something in me loosen slightly. Not into forgiveness exactly, not yet, but into something adjacent to it, something that left room for what might eventually become forgiveness if we were both willing to do the work. I said, "She raised me. She was here when you weren't." That's not an accusation. It's just what happened. And she wrote it down, in her own hand, so that everyone would know she understood the difference. My mother nodded, very carefully, like something was held in the balance and she was afraid of tipping it. My father came out and stood nearby, giving us space, and we stood there for a while, the three of us, on those courthouse steps, not saying much, the city moving around us with its usual beautiful indifference. I had a flight back to Virginia the next morning. I had a job to return to, a briefing on Tuesday, a unit that needed me. I had a life I had built in the years when no one was watching, which had turned out to be the best kind of building, the kind with nothing to prove and nowhere to be except where you actually were. I went to the house that afternoon, alone, with the key Claire had given me. I unlocked the front door and went inside and stood in the entryway and let it settle over me, the smell of it, the specific quality of the light, the familiar arrangement of things that had been exactly where they were for as long as I could remember. My grandmother's coffee mug on the drying rack, her reading glasses on the side table, her picture of my mother on the hall table. Facing the door, I walked through every room slowly and without hurry. I sat for a while in the kitchen where the afternoon light came through the window at that particular angle, falling across the table the same way it always had. I went upstairs and stood in the doorway of my childhood room. I opened the window in the back bedroom and let the April air move through. Then I went out to the back porch and sat in the old chair that faced the garden. The garden needed work, but the spring had come up through it anyway, the rosemary thick and fragrant, the peony shoots pushing up through the dark soil, the climbing rose along the fence, already reaching with new pale green growth along the old wire supports. Unhurried, certain, going about its business the way it had for 40 years, trusting the wire, trusting the season, trusting whatever came next. My grandmother had once said, standing in this same garden, that the secret to the climbing rose was that you could not force it. You put up the wire and you stepped back, and you trusted that the thing knew how to grow. She said some things were like that. People too, she thought. You gave them the structure, and you trusted the process, even when it was slow, even when other people couldn't yet see what you already knew was there. I had been that rose. She had been the wire. I sat in the chair until the light changed, and then I pulled out my phone and called my sergeant major and told him I'd be back by Monday. He said good. I said I knew. Then I put the phone away and sat a while longer in the quiet, in the garden that was mine now. in the chair that had held my grandmother for 40 years, and would hold me for whatever came next. She had written it down. In her own hand, on an ordinary Tuesday, with no audience, with nothing to gain, Diana showed up. I straightened my cover before I left and locked the door behind me and walked down the porch steps into the late afternoon light. The street was quiet. Somewhere down the block, a child was laughing at something. A neighbor I didn't recognize raised a hand from across the yard, and I raised mine back. The house looked different than it had when I arrived that morning. But I knew where I was coming back to. I had always known. I just hadn't had the paperwork until today.